Apple's rise in China is a story of ambition, risk, and transformation. In the early 2010s, China was more than a manufacturing hub. It became Apple's most lucrative market. New Apple stores in Beijing and Shanghai drew massive crowds, with people lining up for days to buy the latest iPhone. Apple quickly became a status symbol, representing modernity and global connection. China soon accounted for billions in annual revenue, with single stores breaking global sales records. Apple invested heavily, building iconic glass storefronts and a retail presence to match its products. The company's promise of quality and innovation resonated with millions of Chinese consumers. Apple's products changed how people communicated, worked, and entertained themselves, embedding the brand into daily life. The App Store fueled a new digital economy, making Apple a powerful force in China. But this deep integration created a dependency. Apple's fortunes became tied to China's. Greater China, including Hong Kong and Taiwan, became a major source of Apple's global profits. Keeping this relationship strong became essential for Apple's dominance. By 2023, revenue from Greater China reached $74 billion, making the partnership seem unbreakable. Apple needed China's customers, and China seemed to need Apple. Yet, beneath the surface, this success bred vulnerability. Apple's deep reliance on China meant it had to navigate complex political and economic realities. The company's future would depend on choices that balanced profit, principle, and power. The very success that made Apple a giant in China was also forging invisible chains. As Apple's influence grew, so did the risks of its dependency. The stage was set for a series of difficult decisions that would define Apple's global legacy. By 2016, Apple's relationship with China faced new threats: regulation, supply chain risks, and government pressure. To protect its future, Tim Cook made a secretive, high-stakes visit to Beijing. The result: Apple quietly pledged $275 billion over 5 years to support China's economic goals. This was more than a business deal. It was a strategic move to appease Beijing and secure Apple's place in the market. The pledge included building R&D centers, upgrading Chinese manufacturers, and investing in renewable energy. Apple promised to help build the very economy it relied on. For China, this was a major win. One of the world's most valuable companies was now a partner in its national ambitions. In return, Apple gained continued access to China's vast market and manufacturing ecosystem. But this secret agreement deepened Apple's dependency and gave Beijing new leverage. Apple was now playing by China's rules, blurring the line between business and diplomacy. The $275 billion pledge locked Apple into a partnership with long-term risks. The company became more vulnerable to political whims and US-China tensions. Apple's short-term security came at the cost of greater exposure and future uncertainty. The secret handshake solved one problem but created many more. Apple's fate was now inextricably linked to China's ambitions and politics. Apple's dependence on China runs deeper than sales. It's built into every iPhone, iPad, and Mac. As of 2025, 90% of Apple products are still assembled in China. Decades of investment created a manufacturing ecosystem unmatched anywhere else. Entire cities, like those run by Foxconn, exist to build Apple devices, employing hundreds of thousands. The Chinese government subsidized land, streamlined regulations, and ensured a steady labor supply. Apple trained local engineers and managers, transferring skills and technology. The supply chain is a dense web of hundreds of specialized suppliers. Moving production elsewhere, like India or Vietnam, requires years of effort and billions in investment. Apple's physical assets in China are worth billions, making a quick exit nearly impossible. The system is optimized for efficiency and cost, all centered in China. Any shift would mean huge expenses and production delays. Apple's manufacturing success has become a golden cage. The very system that made Apple a global leader now binds it tightly to China. To protect its business in China, Apple has made major compromises. In 2018, Apple agreed to store Chinese iCloud data on servers managed by a state-controlled company, raising privacy concerns. The Chinese government gained easier access to millions of users' personal information. Apple also removes thousands of apps from its Chinese App Store at Beijing's request, VPNs, news outlets, and encrypted messaging apps among them. By complying, Apple helps enforce China's strict internet controls, a stark contrast to its image in the West. The company avoids content that could challenge the Communist Party, even censoring emojis and protest-related apps. Apple's business interests consistently outweigh its stated values of privacy and free expression. Market access is the driving force. Beijing holds the power to shut Apple down at any time. Faced with this leverage, Apple chooses cooperation over confrontation. The result, continued profits, but at a significant reputational cost. Critics say Apple has become a willing partner in China's digital authoritarianism. Apple's compromises in China go beyond data and apps. They extend to real-world incidents. In 2010, a violent crackdown at a Shanghai Apple store was swiftly covered up, with security footage erased and witnesses silenced. Apple chose silence, prioritizing its relationship with authorities over transparency. This culture of compliance is fueled by immense financial incentives. China's support, land, labor, and regulatory help enabled Apple's explosive growth. In return, Apple became a quiet, cooperative partner, avoiding conflict at all costs. The company's annual revenues in China, often exceeding $70 billion, made silence profitable. Apple has managed countless sensitive situations by putting business first. This includes aligning maps with China's territorial claims and scrubbing marketing of anything politically sensitive. Each decision is guided by the need to maintain access to its most critical foreign market. The price of silence has been high, but for years Apple was willing to pay it. Now, as global scrutiny grows, this strategy is harder to sustain. Apple's balancing act between the US and China is now nearly impossible. Rising tensions have put the company in the crossfire of two superpowers. US lawmakers criticize Apple's dependence on China and its ethical compromises. Meanwhile, Beijing targets American brands with regulatory pressure and promotes domestic rivals. Nationalist sentiment threatens Apple's sales as Chinese consumers turn to local brands. Every decision risks angering one side or the other. Condemning China's policies could trigger boycotts or supply chain disruptions. Compliance with Beijing draws criticism at home. The stakes are enormous. Hundreds of billions in revenue and Apple's entire production system are at risk. Tim Cook and Apple's leaders must navigate a shrinking space for neutrality. Apple is now a pawn in a global power struggle, its every move watched by both Washington and Beijing. Reduce its dependence on China, Apple is slowly diversifying its supply chain. Since 2023, the company has shifted some manufacturing to India and Vietnam. These countries offer large labor pools and eager governments, but lack China's infrastructure and efficiency. Quality control and production pace remain challenges in new locations. Building factories, training workers, and creating supplier networks takes years and billions in investment. Despite these hurdles, Apple is ramping up iPhone production in India and assembling AirPods and MacBooks in Vietnam. These moves signal Apple's intent to reduce reliance on China, but the scale remains small. Most Apple products will still be made in China for years to come. The slow shift highlights the depth of Apple's dilemma. Moving away from China means higher costs and greater complexity. Diversification is a strategic necessity, but it comes with a painful price. Apple's supply chain transformation will define its future for the next decade. Apple's story in China has reached a critical turning point. The company's deep entanglement with China is now its greatest vulnerability. Can Apple ever truly reduce its dependence, or will it be forced to choose sides in a global conflict? The stakes go beyond profits. They touch on Apple's identity and survival. The $275 billion pledge secured Apple's position but deepened its obligations to Beijing. If Apple stays the course, it risks alienating Western lawmakers and consumers. A rapid withdrawal could cripple its business model and hand an advantage to Chinese competitors. Apple's future may be shaped by forces beyond its control, especially the US-China relationship. The company must now master geopolitical navigation as skillfully as it designs products. The trillion-dollar question, can a global brand remain truly global in a divided world? Apple's next moves will ripple across the global economy and define its legacy. Apple's at a crossroads, with every path fraught with risk. The era of easy growth in China is over. The future demands tough choices. One option: accelerate diversification, investing heavily in India, Vietnam, and beyond. This would mean higher costs and lower efficiency, testing investor patience. Another path: maintain the balancing act, complying with both Beijing and Western critics. But this dual compliance is becoming less effective as both sides demand loyalty. Every US-China flare-up becomes an existential threat to Apple's business. A dramatic rupture, like a Taiwan crisis, could force Apple to abandon China overnight, triggering global tech chaos. Apple's relationship with China is a test case for the future of globalization. Can a multinational serve two masters with opposing values? The answer will shape not just Apple's fate, but the new world order. The choices made in Cupertino's boardrooms will echo far beyond the iPhone. Apple's future and perhaps the future of global business will be forged in uncertainty.